Here are our notes on ancient China. First of all, looking at the geography of China, they are, just like our other civilizations, located near a river, and the Yellow River is their main source for getting all the water and irrigation needs. It's called that because of the the yellow soil or silt that comes when the river floods. Growing crops was possible thanks to the fertile soil and rainy summers that they had. And once again, an ancient civilization relying on rain and especially relying on the river flooding and being able to get the fertile soil that comes from that so that they can grow the crops that they need. One really important part about China is its geography. They are located and surrounded by mountains and the ocean and desert. And these natural barriers that surround them, first of all, we have mountains, desert, and these mountains and desert that surround them and the ocean on the east coast, it isolates them. In other words, it keeps them away from being able to interact as easily with other nations. So what happens is when you don't really interact with a lot of other people, you don't really change that much. I mean, a lot of the reasons why things change in our country now is because we have a very connected world where we all see each other and we know what styles and fashions and trends are going on around the world because of information that gets out there. But if we were very isolated and we didn't know anything that was going on around us, you're not as likely to change. So China didn't really change a whole lot for thousands of years. A lot of it was because of their traditions that were kept because they were isolated from the rest of the world. So that's why the next fill in is the word isolated. And therefore, they had very little influence from other civilizations and countries. Their social structure and social pyramid, we start at the top, and they have a leader, a king, that is also known as an emperor. And beneath him in that social pyramid would be wealthy landowners who helped lead smaller regions in China. And then you have your kind of middle class workers, craftsmen, traders, artisans. Towards the bottom, you have farmers and slaves. Slaves weren't as there weren't a ton of slaves, but there were a lot of farmers. Farmers would be the largest group. It says they, but really I mean that farmers, if you want to make a note of that in your notes there, farmers were the largest group. The emperors were part of a ruling family. We've talked about this before, called a dynasty. And the king or emperor gets his authority through something called mandate of heaven. And mandate of heaven is part of Chinese tradition and law that states that the importance of family and dynasty and all that. So what they would believe is that the leader in charge got his power from the birth line, which was blessed to him because of mandate of heaven. You know, that the gods would dictate that this next person in line would be there. And so he has that power because he is approved by the gods. Now, he could lose that mandate of heaven if his actions are not right, if natural disasters are occurring, which they would say, well, clearly the gods must not be happy with this leader. Or if a new dynasty tries to overthrow him and they are successful, then the Chinese people could look at it and say, well, then that new dynasty, that new family that's taking over, they must have mandate of heaven or else they wouldn't have been successful. So that's the way that they understood the world, and the way that they understood leadership was that the leaders were blessed by the gods, and whoever was in charge for a reason. Their economy is very much built on farming, so they are an agricultural economy. 90% of the people were farmers. Not a lot of trade was done with other civilizations until later on in their history, and that would be through the Silk Road that we'll learn more about later. But initially, they were pretty isolated, like I said before, and that's an important part of understanding China and their geography is their isolation. Family is very important to this day. I mean, family is important in the United States, sure, but I mean, it's even more important in Asian countries, and China is part of that. And so, family is the most important part of life. And doing your family duty and showing respect to those who are have earned that respect. Elders were given great respect. Your parents, your grandparents. There's a much bigger amount of respect given to the elderly in Asian countries today and throughout history compared to the United States. So much respect so that in our day today you'd be more likely to send people off to nursing home and things like that, or the elderly can be forgotten a lot in our country. But in China, in history as well as today, there was the older generations are very well respected, and so you would have them living with you, multiple generations living in the same house, grandparents and your parents, 3 or 4 generations all living together. And the men in the family, like most in history, usually, especially in ancient times, the man had the most authority in the house. The father was the one that his what he said mattered the most. Women and mothers had very little or no power, legal rights. Overall, there's this belief in China that the group is more important than the individual. What that means is that they believe, family is more important than just focusing on yourself. Your country is more important than focusing on yourself. In our country, in the United States, we put a lot of emphasis on the individual, the achievement of every individual, and being able to stand out as an individual. But in China, in ancient times, and even to a degree today, there's a much bigger focus on being a part of the group rather than just being an individual. In terms of religion, family, once again, is very important because they do this thing called ancestor worship, which you would have read a little bit about in that actively learn assignment, where they believe that they have this spiritual connection even after their ancestors have passed. And therefore, that's why family is even more important because even in the afterlife, they are connected. They are polytheistic, belief in many gods. And in terms of religion, Chinese people were more interested in following philosophy than faith or religion. You can put either word there. And what I mean by that is they're not as much focused on the ability to describe their beliefs through some sort of holy text or Bible, like maybe you would think of for Christianity or Muslim or Islam or Judaism or anything like that. They're more so focused on doing the right thing, having this philosophical understanding of how the world works, how we should act, how we should do the right thing. That was more important than a religion. So they're not a super religious people. Some of the contributions of ancient China, like some other ones, they did contribute a written language and they used pictures and symbols instead of an alphabetical language, and still their language impacts that. They invented or used the iron plow and other use of copper tools. They were the first civilization to farm by planting in rows, so that was an agricultural advancement. Silk we'll talk about later is a super important part, and they controlled flooding with their advanced system of irrigation. These are just some of the contributions.